I'll, I'll just give like a 30-second background on myself, but I came up through traditional IT on the Windows side, but I've also heavy into automation on the Windows side for my entire career. But I've also maintained a LAMP stack for my own business servers and blogs. So have been dangerous enough with Linux. And then in my last job, I ran a team that was kind of fully 50-50 Linux and Windows, mainly software deployment automation in the space of creating automation templates and that kind of thing. So I was just going to give you guys some details about Chocolatey. I've got some thoughts and ideas sketched out and some visuals to show you, but are there any specifics that people are thinking in terms of or have a question on that I can make sure that I hit with anything that we go through?
I don't think anything in particular. I think we're all somewhat unfamiliar with the overall ecosystem and are just interested in seeing what it's all about.
Okay. So as I go through, I'm going to try to create bridges. Is everyone pretty much Linux background, or has anyone done a lot with Windows or considers themselves multi-plat?
I used to be a .NET developer a long, long
Okay.
time ago, way, way before .NET Core was ever a thing. So
Okay.
we're talking like 8 years ago, probably.
Okay. So I'll generally assume that everyone's Linux familiar and Linux background. And at any point, if I start saying stuff that you're like, this is dull, I knew this like 10 years ago, please speak up and we'll, we'll accelerate. I'm going to actually cheat and use some of the Pluralsight course slides, which in our current context is an acceptable use. I'm just going to nick through some of them, try to give you some of those connections and see where we can go from there. So let me just grab. Okay, so I'm gonna share. And oh, that's uncool, wrong screen. All right, so basically NuGet. So first I want to talk a little bit about NuGet because Chocolatey is built on NuGet in a unique way. So NuGet is basically the .NET flavor of the open source problem of getting your dependencies assembled, whether it's for development or for deployment. And so you can kind of think of it as NPM for .NET. And if Nick might have a better analogy for me, but that's kind of the way that I think of NuGet in terms of it's generally designed to pull together dependencies for software development specifically in build and deployment environments. And so the whole NuGet structure, the NuGet packages, and the processing client NuGet exe are designed to deliver that kind of experience. In that, we have the creation tools, a basic file format. You guys have developed some NuGet. Have you guys developed package creation capabilities yet or played with it, or is it mainly the feed capabilities that have been developed so far?
We've barely just been touching the surface. We've started to look into feed capabilities, but haven't really built anything out yet.
Okay, and of course, I think in GitLab's current offerings, what I'm talking about here would be the responsibility of the customer at this point, unless we get so mature that we're doing like automated deployment to .NET or to Windows in some form. So basically, there's a new spec file, basic file specification for creating a new package. You create that package. When you create it, you can target multiple .NET serializations, but when you do that, you get a compiled assembly for each target. So if you're targeting .NET 3, .NET 4, .NET Core 2, then you end up with a compiled object for each one. They all get included because the process of installing is very simplistic. You then load that up to potentially to a store of some type, a feed-based store using the API, very standard APIs. And then when the client wants to use this, they use NuGet exe, which is the client. You don't really need to install it. It can run just as a bare exe. And then that installs the .NET assemblies. If you run from within Visual Studio Code, we'll touch on this a little bit later, then there is the possibility of doing some additional logic to wire it up. And if you run outside of Visual Studio Code, you just run plain NuGet exe, then you're basically getting a file extraction to a location of your choice that can potentially target whatever serialization you're going for. So it's automation ready, middleware, handles middleware and toolkits. It's for dev and prod in terms of dependency resolution. And you can create the packaging. It's mainly focused around server applications compared to, you can use it for client apps, but there's no GUI experience for individuals who are trying to install software on their target system. So you might use it in the background. It does not have an interactive UI. It does not handle issues of permissions on end user type devices. And it does not handle user configuration of the app. And it doesn't handle non.NET installs. This original information is targeted around a lot of administrators who are making packaging that hits desktop endpoints. So it's kind of reflected in some of the things that are drawn out here. Obviously, when we're hitting cloud-based scaled endpoints, a lot of the user stuff doesn't matter. The NuGet install engine, it basically, when you run NuGet exe, it's going to make that request out to the API endpoint, the feed endpoint. It's going to get back information about the packages and any dependency packages based on the new spec file. You can say, I depend on these, and it'll do the full dependency tree search like it would with other package managers. Within that is going to be some metadata. There's a version that's attached to it. And some dependency information as well as the packaged files. And if you're in the space of VS Code, there is the capability to run a little bit of PowerShell. Otherwise, you get basic file placement. You guys are already familiar with feeds and authenticated feeds from other systems. I just want to point out that in the case of NuGet, it can treat a folder full of files just like a repo. So if I have 500 dependencies, I could throw them all in one folder, assuming that they don't have any overlapping names, and I could say, NuGet, I need this installed, and here's another source location for dependencies, and it would traverse that as if it was a fully functional feed. This can make certain deployment scenarios really cool, like products like Octopus that are deploying .NET. Instead of having to have a feed set up, you could theoretically just bring a bulk load of files. Anyone doing infrastructure automation would also be tempted to do that, so they don't have to set up a feed, or they don't have to have external dependencies on the internet, especially for production scaling. Okay, then I'm going to skip over to another presentation. Okay, so this is adding the Chocolatey perspective to what we just talked about. So we saw this before. This is your standard NuGet creation and consumption model. Okay, so we already saw that setup once just a minute ago. Let's add in the Chocolatey bit. So Chocolatey is going to take and extend this to be able to do operating system packages. So here's a simple way to think about it. What if I used NPM to install browsers on servers, or install patches on servers, or some other operating system? What if I could kind of shoehorn it into providing Yum type capabilities that we typically use a completely different package manager for? And this is basically all Chocolatey has done, is we go ahead and we hijack an existing system, especially the feed system, feed APIs. We don't have to write all that special, and we use it to do operating system packages with just a few simple tweaks, or what started out as a few simple tweaks. So with Chocolatey, We have a CPAC utility, which is very similar to the NuGet packing utility. We create a standard new package file, which, by the way, if you're not already familiar, is just a zip file. If you rename it to zip and double click it or unzip it with the utility, it'll just unzip. It's based on the standard that Microsoft and a few other places tried to make as a standard encapsulating format for all kinds of file things. Didn't take off, but it's basically based on the zip format. So then you upload to chocolatey.org instead of NuGet.org. Then in the Chocolatey client, when we do the install, what ends up happening is we are able to install to the operating system. So instead of being able to just install dependencies into .NET, whether it's my development or my development or production environment, I can now install operating system packages. So that install can now be a zip, an MSI, an MSU, a setup exe. So all these other setup types can now be either encapsulated into my new package, or as we'll see with Chocolatey, they're usually external and downloaded and checksummed dynamically. And then that makes it so that the packages and the job of chocolatey.org is much simpler. So with Chocolatey, when we okay, so this is your NuGet engine. And if we chocolatize this, we basically are doing very similar work. We now have an installable client for Chocolatey. Also, this hasn't worked out so well, which we'll talk about in a bit, but Windows, as of PowerShell 5, got a true package manager, but it's a meta package manager. So if you could manage a package manager that could manage Yum packages and NPM packages, and it would just all consider those providers and consumers of the overall concept of delivering content through packages. That's what PowerShell built-in package management is, and it's becoming Windows platform package management, really. But basically, there's a whole bunch of packaging formats in Windows and other operating systems. So going forward, anyone in the community can actually develop providers to the package manager that's built into PowerShell, no matter what the target is, Linux or Windows, and they can start providing packaging through that. So the big secret here is if there's certain PowerShell files in a certain folder inside the new package, Chocolatey goes, there's my target, grab Chocolatey, install, and run it. It also, there can be a Chocolatey uninstall, and it knows that if I run a Chocolatey uninstall command, go to the cached repo of cached folders of packages and see if there's an uninstall and run it. If not, it's got a whole bunch of automatic uninstall capabilities where during the install, it does a heuristic detection of whether it's an MSI, it's a setup exe, and there's about 5,000 kinds of setup exes there can be on Windows as to what built the setup exe, and it's able to fingerprint which one it is and know the silent uninstall commands. So there's also an automatic uninstall capability. Then with Chocolatey, a lot of the packages, it actually goes and fetches the files and does a checksum on them to make sure that they're exactly what the package was originally designed and tested around. And then it copies over that setup file and runs it. You should also be aware that chocolatey.org does a lot of virus scanning on everything that is uploaded to it. It submits to VirusTotal, as well as any of these HTTP references. It pulls them down and scans them too, and you can see the results on chocolatey.org that it has done this. So in some ways, it's been upping the bar on what a public repo should do in terms of packaging. Okay, yeah, this all just gets chocolatized. We already talked about that. There's not really any special tools here. It's just text editors and CPAC. There's still things it doesn't do for packaging. So it is really more of a Yum type packager. It does not replace something like MSI. It doesn't really focus on users running installs. So whatever you package with it, they have to be completely silent, even if it is a user install. It's not going to pop up a dialog where a user picks options or types in data. Okay. Oh, and all of its feed capabilities are directly inherited from NuGet. So it doesn't have any additions to the feed capabilities that a feed that serves Chocolatey is identical to a feed that serves NuGet. So anything like you go to Nexus repo, they don't have anything called a Chocolatey feed. And that's because you just create a NuGet feed and Chocolatey could be completely serviced by it. And then we'll jump over here. I probably already mentioned this. Basically, I'm just going to populate this. This is comparing the Chocolatey client, which can run in CMD CLI, so it's not PowerShell tethered. And it is, you can either do Chocolatey space install or cinst. So there's cinst, cuninst, clist. So there's a bunch of aliases built in as well. The Windows Management Package Provider, which started with PowerShell 5 and it's continuing into PowerShell Core, there's a provider so that you can do Chocolatey packages, and this really hasn't come together. At a certain point, a Microsoft employee started the provider. They were done with it. The Chocolatey community said, well, we might maintain it, but then they've been not maintaining it because they can't simply install the whole Chocolatey client and just have a stub that references it. So then they have to have two code bases, a .NET assembly that does virtually everything Chocolatey does, and the Chocolatey client. So they've been hesitant to own it. So consequently, you basically have to install the Chocolatey client as opposed to using the built-in package provider, which would make this a lot simpler. I'm not going to go through that, but I just want to show you a quick demo of the overall Windows package management, which might be of interest for your team in the long run. But let's do find package provider. So it's got a provider and consumer model. So on PowerShell Core, these are the package providers that I could install. So I can install PowerShell Get, which lets me get stuff from the PowerShell gallery. I can install the container image provider, which lets me pull down specific container images from any container registry. And then Nano Server package. Nano totally did away with the normal Windows way of installing software on the Windows platform because they wanted to strip down to a super microized kernel. So it's got its own packaging type management that's much more simple, and you can only really manage that through PowerShell. If I do get package provider, I can see what ones I have installed locally. So I can discover new installable package managers, which can be populated by open source efforts or whatever, and then I can install those package managers, and then I can configure that resource to that package manager's specific way of dealing with packages. And you don't have to be at Microsoft to extend this in any way. Here's the ones for Windows PowerShell. So there are a lot more of them. So there's GitHub and GitLab as providers, where basically you kind of expose a script up on GitHub or GitLab, and then you can use it as a package within the package manager. There is stuff for Office 365. There's Pacman provider. So there's a lot of different providers. This is not completely managed by Microsoft. So you could have one on here that's not working so well, or someone lost interest in maintaining it. So don't assume that, like old-timey Microsoft, that if it appears in some list in the operating system, that means that it's authorized, maintained, and overseen by Microsoft in any way. You have basically the same guarantees of open source. Someone could open source plugin, someone could lose interest, or it doesn't take off, or whatever. And then finally, just wanted to give, oh, wait a second here. Let's go on to this guy. So chocolatey.org is a free open source package repository. So all it is someone said, oh, I need Google Chrome at my company, or I feel like doing this because I'm a packager, a Microsoft Windows packager, and I enjoy doing it. So they go create a package for Google Chrome, that becomes the official, but it's totally FOSS. So if they only tested it on one OS target, or they didn't do something quite right that's not genericized to the massive target of Windows base, it could have problems or errors. And the process for getting those fixed is the standard open source. You go find out in the Chocolatey repository, where is that package, and then you go ask for it to be fixed up. So if we go find a package, let's see here. Okay, so here's Adobe Acrobat Reader. And I can find out, this is the GUI to the repo. So like if you ever gone into Nexus repo, the GUI is pretty ugly. So one thing about the whole Windows community and packaging is they kind of expect it to look like chocolatey.org or NuGet.org. And the Microsoft native tool ProGet, which originally only ever did NuGet repositories, made sure and made pains for their GUI to look like what these repositories look like. Chocolatey's recently received a pretty big overhaul. So it shows you what files are inside, virus scan results for all files that are inside and files that are pulled down by the package. Release notes, which the developer has control over by the new spec file. And then you have on the left here, who packaged it. This is the guy who invented Chocolatey. Where the source is. So if I open this, I can see where, in this case, the source is on GitHub. I can see where the source is. I can go through it. I could make a copy of it. I could curate it internally and run it, build this package internal in my company. One thing I might want to do if I'm pulling it internal is to put the source files inside the package rather than have them referenced externally, so that they're not out on the internet. And so that if I need to use this Adobe Reader that's in 10 years, the same old version, I have a copy of the installer internally. And plus chocolatey.org, one of the reasons it has to do this is it doesn't want to violate any agreements by any company. So if you're not supposed to, as a company, re-provide the installer even, then this is how Chocolatey gets around not re-providing the installer inside of their organization. If you're under 50 megs and the user agreement clearly states that it's okay to redistribute, then you can go ahead and put the installer right inside the new package and upload it to Chocolatey. And also usually down here will be, an issues link, how do you report issues, licenses, all that kind of information is right here. This is justification for companies to curate. So this whole thing was around me also letting people know you need to get something like Nexus or ProGet or Artifactory, because you don't really want to be consuming these FOSS packages off the internet. So it's kind of the same idea of, I don't want my NPM packages to be out on the internet. When I worked at Infor, you weren't allowed to do that because if during production scaling, the NPM public repository was not available and you were pulling all your dependencies, you couldn't do an auto scale of a new instance of your server. So that was no good. So you had to, in theory, you're supposed to pull all dependencies internal. In this case, we're discussing you should really be curating them too, not simply pulling them down and trusting them all. Now, of course, GitLab has the ability to scan. Well, it has the ability to scan the software, so I guess you would get dependencies in here. Nexus's whole scanning capability is based on assuming you already have packages. So GitLab is a step better than that in that we can scan packages, but also anything else that's in the code base. So this is, oops, I must have spun my mouse there. This is just showing you what kind of install types you can encapsulate. So Chocolatey lets you encapsulate all the traditional installers on Windows, but it also lets you encapsulate non-installs. So basically, if you have a Windows piece of software that just drops in exe, there is no install, or it's all inside of a zip, Chocolatey adds value around that to making it appear like it's a formal install. So one of the things it does is if you unzip software, it puts a stub into on the path. So automatically, if you install something that is one of these portables, it's going to be on the path automatically as a side step. It also proxies elevated permissions in the case that it's a end user piece of software. So there's a few little things it does for these kind of non-installs, if you will. Okay, and then finally, this is from the PowerShell and DevOps conference I spoke at a couple years ago now. Here's one of the big things that it adds for software distribution on the Windows side. So if you look at all of these types of installs across the bottom, and then you look at all the possible consumers of those installs, Windows folks have a permutations problem. 11 times 8 in this case, 88 individual possibilities of me having to figure out how to make this work under that. And so that's a big pain. What Chocolatey does, it says, let's make a standardized interface at the package level. And now I can present that API to these machines, and I dramatically drop my permutations. This is both at runtime, but test time as well. If I can get a Chocolatey package to run under Octopus Deploy or PowerShell, then I'm pretty 99% sure it's going to run under all the rest of these. And, oh wait, did I? Yeah. Then we get to repositories. This is just an example. I'm just going to blow this right out to the full on capability. So if I get a new NuGet feed, I can both, I can curate FOSS into it. I can also create my own packages during CI and then put them in the repo and use them during deployment, as we would do with all package managers. But I can also service a lot of non-managed scenarios. So this is really a lot about how feeds work and the fact that you can use them for development, or in the case of Chocolatey packages, because they are standalone operating system packages, you have a lot of flexibility. So a lot of companies will have, we just talked to a company where all of their branch builds, development, and testing goes on workstations, and they only care for GitLab. Once you upload it and merge it into one of their 3 branches, that's when they start caring about CI. So in that scenario, you could build that workstation with these packages, or do whatever you needed to with these packages. And in this case, it was indeed Windows. So basically, you have the idea of a packager that does software development dependencies, then one that does operating systems. So Chocolatey kind of unifies those two. But then I was advocating within the Windows community to push it one step further, which is to also put your automation orchestration in there. So instead of having a bunch of junk tethered to Chef or Packer or CloudFormation where you can't reuse it, you do simple automation packages like install IIS. Usually that ends up in this level here in some sort of proprietary mechanism. At more than 2 different organizations, I pushed that kind of logic into packages. So all the orchestration logic was run package, run package, run package, run package, run package. So even a bit of orchestration automation, I would put it in there, and all of a sudden, we were able to deploy any which way. We could deploy to a VM on Mac. We could deploy to native Windows workstations. We could deploy to the cloud for CI, or the cloud for a developer workstation in the cloud. So what it did was it took one more step further and said, no, orchestration automation code should be loosely coupled, not tightly coupled to these frameworks. You basically choose where your automation logic layer would go. That's a novel perspective that's not really huge in the Windows or Chocolatey communities right now, but it was something that I still feel strongly about. By not allowing yourself to get tethered to these middle folks, you actually make your build capabilities of that stack much more flexible. In my case, one of the things that was a pressure was they wanted to do Chef, but they were doing it serverless, and without the server version and paying for it, you can't get all the data capabilities to share data and then config data. Then they were going to pay for it, but they didn't want to pay for every developer workstation, but we wanted to use the exact same packages to build developer workstations as we did for everything else. So by doing it this way, whether you're going to license and drive it with Chef or not, it would work. It would be agnostic to the overall orchestrator. So that's everything that I have as far as the just kind of giving the background. And hopefully it helps you place too that if we get folks who are doing Chocolatey, they're going to have a lot of questions around, stuff like, how do I get packages out of chocolatey.org and put them inside of GitLab? Oh, I should also tell you guys that there is a image out there. This image here, Linaturk Mono Choco, is .NET Mono running on Linux with some additional utilities to be able to build Chocolatey packages. So this is still working, though it's not an official output of the Chocolatey organization or anyone else, but today you can build new packages, which means you can build Chocolatey packages on Mono. So we could have that capability without having to have native Windows containers or native Windows runners. Yeah, I think you're muted, Steve.
Oh, I was coughing, but
Oh, okay.
no, this is awesome. Thank you so much for putting this all together and then presenting for us. It's super helpful.
Yeah.
I have a couple maybe high-level questions. So I'm curious, from your experience, do you see people discover and start using Chocolatey when they have that specific need of dealing with operating system packages, or is it more well known as just kind of having this smoother interface and smoother ability of not having to deal with all of the different the 11 times 8 problem as
Right.
well?
Right. Frankly, okay, so there's a traditional IT and then the DevOps or SaaS company probably, or a true DevOps organization inside of traditional IT. So on the traditional IT side, they of course try to drive so they don't have 11 possible, across the top or whatever we had there for different
Sure.
mechanisms. But some companies do acquisitions and they can't afford to, convert everyone from SCCM to another traditional IT product. And some companies have, Infor had SCCM by the IT department, but they were 100% SaaS companies. So all the SaaS development didn't care about SCCM, and I highly recommended not to put it on SaaS stacks. It's designed around internal development. So it kind of depends where they're coming at it from. So IT departments will see this as a way to, if they have a complex enough run environment, they'll see it as a way to make that simpler. Unfortunately, if they're like a 100% SCCM shop, there's things that SCCM itself adds value that trying to go on the Chocolatey packages might go a little bit backwards. The other pressure to do it is there's already existing packages. There's some pretty complicated logic in some of these packages because you think something like installing Google Chrome should be simple. Well, it is, unless you want to customize 10 things as well. So that config management piece a lot of times gets worked into these FOSS packages.
Okay.
On the developer side, I think a lot's going to depend on, it's just really going to depend on whether developers have responsibility to do the automation. So where I was at Infor, initially developers did not, but when they went to the new multi-tenant infrastructure, they were forced to take on the burden of doing their own automation. So the same development team had to build the automation to deploy as well as build the software. So then that's another place that might be an entry point where people are like, okay, for our test systems, we need Chrome because we're going to drive browsers with, a test framework. Do we sit here as pure software devs and try to figure out what all those crazy infrastructure guys do to get Chrome installed and configured, or do we go grab this Chocolatey package? Well, what's going to happen if they get aware of it at all. So, and right now in the Windows community, it was pushed really hard. You guys should also realize there is a monthly PowerShell call. It's basically Microsoft open source initiatives. Those guys are super open source. The first demos I saw of PowerShell 6 years ago, the guy was using VI to edit his code because he was a Linux salt from way back. And so when PowerShell was not built to compete with VB script and CMD, it was built to compete with Bash before they ever knew that they would be multi-platform. So all the comments you hear early on of Jeffrey Snover talking about it, he's talking about Bash, VMS, all the shells that they went and grabbed the best practices from. They never dreamed at the time that .NET could go multi-plat and that they could too. So it's instructive to sit in those calls and hear what's going on in that community too as well, because it's a pretty authentic open source movement there.
Cool. When it comes to the whole multi-platform aspect, is there anything, I mean, because I think at least we're all on Linux machines, and I don't know if anyone has on our team at least has a Windows environment set up. When it comes to like if we're building out a feed or just, the basic package management structure, do you think there's any concern about any specific scenarios where we might want to have a Windows machine available to be able to test specific download and install capabilities?
I think so, because if you're going to test whether it's deploying properly, you're going to want to run the real client, so NuGet exe or Chocolatey clients if you put them into your test portfolio. You could use Server 2016 headless VM. You could spin up something in AWS, whether it has a GUI or not for Windows,
Sure.
or in Azure. I probably would not use PowerShell core on Mac to try to validate that everything's happening as the way it would on a Windows box. The pathing's different. And so, yeah, it's not so ubiquitous that, and then also developers you would also potentially want to validate Visual Studio installs. So if a team has a whole bunch of NuGet dependencies of their own that are just mapped out in NuGet, then they're going to potentially want to run that on Visual Studio to install their own dependencies for their own development. So you might also need to look at having Visual Studio running, and can it talk to the feed? So yeah, at a minimum, NuGet exe, Visual Studio, because those are the officially supported and official targets of NuGet, just bare NuGet. And then if you wanted to make sure that you could have a Chocolatey conversation with customers, you'd probably want to run some Chocolatey tests as well.
And so, like, I've really only brushed the surface on a lot of this, but my understanding is that all of the different NuGet systems are using that same feed API for the most part. So from what I can tell, as long as we can implement that feed API properly, we should be able to handle all of the different platforms properly. But I wasn't sure if you had any experience that could speak
I
to
would
that.
agree. Yeah, I would totally agree. The one caution I would add is that, and I think I don't know if where I mentioned this, but Windows folks tend to be more GUI driven. It's no secret, right? So they go to NuGet.org and Chocolatey.org and they see a certain GUI. And I know, I gave this feedback to Nexus recently. When you go to a Nexus feed, it looks like just a table of attribute data, and it's really ugly. And I encourage them, and I think it's skinnable on Nexus. I encourage them for a NuGet feed, give a default skin that looks somewhat like Chocolatey, or now Chocolatey does enhanced metadata extraction when you upload to the feed to build that page view. But I encourage them to put a pretty GUI on it so that it matches, so that people. Oh, and ProGet was the Windows was the one that has a Windows heritage as far as doing NuGet feeds. Unfortunately, as a person implementing a technology, you have an outsized view of the importance of the interactive parts of it. So you sit there and you go, "Oh man, these feeds suck," And it took me a while at one company to realize it doesn't matter. The developers are never going to be in here because they're not using it as a catalog of what they want to install. They're just going to push it up into the feed with an API and pull it down at deployment time with an API. They're really never going to be in here. So I was able to think through that. You might find that a lot of product selectors are going to get hung up on whether there's a graphical view of the feed and whether it looks like what they're familiar with. But that can be just a strategic kind of thing, right? That you think about and try to find out how customers are responding. If these guys are pure .NET shops, they're already running like .NET Core or Windows containers, they're probably not going to care a whit. But you'll probably start getting both kinds of customers, chewing at you, and you're going to be wondering, why do they care what a GUI? Why do we need a GUI? Why do they care what it looks like? So, you'll because of Chocolatey, you'll end up with a lot of like IT admin kind of input, and part of it depends what the strategy is with feeds. So, like Team City, which I'm familiar with, had an internal feed that would just feed the pipeline out to CD and out to, and then even Octopus would grab the package and have an internal feed or just artifact transfer if there's no dependencies. And then everybody started demanding, oh, that feed's useful to me. I want to be able to see it outside the product. So I want to be able to just reference it as a feed like I would go to a public repository. And so that's another place where I don't know, as you're developing feeds, where that fits into your decision tree of, well, do we do that? Or is the feed just internal to CD, to GitLab CD only and that kind of stuff. But as soon as you make it external, someone's going to want to upload Chocolatey packages probably, and I'd be asking, where's the GUI? So just some things, why you might get some of those requests. And obviously no need to service them before too many people are asking, but.
Would you parallel the idea of a feed to what NPM kind of calls a registry in general? It's just where the packages are stored.
Well, so to me, a feed, sometimes, here's an interesting distinction why I drew out that NuGet, you can point it at a big directory full of files, is sometimes the feed on the server end is providing some sort of logic of doing something, where on NuGet it doesn't, and I know other ones don't. The client has all the logic for resolving dependencies. So that would be an important distinctive difference is, and I'm not sure, you guys might tell me, hey, every feed we've been exposed to, all the logics on the client for dependency resolution. Yeah, definitely it's the same. Registry, anytime you take an artifact that I want to use for dependencies during CI or development or push to production, to me, it's the exact same concept.
Okay, that's kind of what I thought. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't missing something due to the terminology. And then I have one other question. I don't know, I mean, others might have questions too. I'm kind of hogging all the questions. So after the chat, it sounds like NuGet or Chocolatey is a wrapper around NuGet. So if we implement the NuGet feed, is it conceivable that building Chocolatey on top of, like, if we built Chocolatey, would we be likely implementing that feed system as well anyways, or?
Yeah, you are, if you develop a full NuGet feed capability, anyone will be able to do Chocolatey on top of it. And really, it's not a wrapper around, it's actually injection within. So when I do a Chocolatey CPAC, it's going to do a standard NuGet CPAC and make sure that certain files are there and do certain validation. Now I've got a standalone NuGet artifact that no NuGet repository will ever know has Chocolatey stuff in it. Then when it gets to the client, which is also owned by Chocolatey, it's smart enough to go, after we extract this package, whoa, hey, there's a Chocolatey install. Let's run that puppy. And then they've got a whole bunch of, they'll build a whole library of their own extension functions within that PowerShell Chocolatey install that you can use to make things easier, to validate things, to make sure things get in the right places. So really, it's not a wrapper around NuGet. It basically injects stuff in at the build time and then has a smart client to notice that stuff on the extraction time and run it. So yeah, you get it for free. You get Chocolatey for free in that regard.
Okay, cool. That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a follow-up question to this. So as far as I understood, if we release the NuGet feed, we get Chocolatey for free. Should we worry at all about like mixing the two, or it's completely transparent, or it's something that worry the user? It's something that we should take care in the UI, for example, to identify what is Chocolatey and what is pure NuGet, and so on.
Good question. Yeah, so Nexus doesn't bother distinguishing between Chocolatey and NuGet, and I think that that's a reasonable place for GitLab to be. ProGet does distinguish, and I think it's because they provide a GUI, and that's part of their value. So if you call something a Chocolatey feed, they're going to get as close to Chocolatey as possible. And now NuGet and Chocolatey don't look so similar anymore, and UIs. So that allows Proget to do an update where they then sync to the current Chocolatey GUI. So I think any distinctions are only if you're trying to present a GUI for the feed for like a catalog, and if you want it to look like the target feed. But as an API set for CI/CD, yeah, I don't. Most mature shops should understand there's no difference. Basically, if I want to do Chocolatey, I go into the product and say, give me a NuGet feed, and then I pump in Chocolatey packages.
And can the user be confused? So, for example, a user that is searching a dependency may accidentally put full-blown software as a dependency, or because not knowing the like user and practices are the question that comes out.
It can't be done. Well, so with NuGet, it resolves all dependencies in whatever list of sources you give it across source. Wait a second. Regular NuGet packages may not cross feeds. I'm not sure, but I know Chocolatey can for sure. So if I have an internal package, it depends on packages that are only in the public feed. I can say Chocolatey install my cool package -sources NuGet.org and my internal feed, and it will resolve dependencies across that. There is no very low chance of someone putting Chocolatey dependencies in a NuGet package or NuGet dependencies in a chocolate package. So they both basically resolve. I'm not sure, though you could test it. It might actually work to put NuGet package IDs in a Chocolatey package and make sure that NuGet is on there. But I don't know that it's going to position them like the bare NuGet client would. It might just extract it and go, there's no Chocolatey install here. So yeah, it would be hard. It would be hard to get those to cross up dependencies across that barrier.
So the reason why I'm asking is because we want to present the UI also for a way for the user to shop for dependency as well.
Okay.
And so if our registry contains both type, I'm afraid that they may get confused and then wonder why things don't work, especially for name clashing, like packages with same names and
right. So I guess I would just say if your view was per feed, which like a container registry, there's only one feed, right? And that would maybe be the difference between what we're calling a registry and a feed, where with NuGet feeds, it would make sense then to, like as if you can envision having two container registries in one repo, you should probably allow N feeds in a repo or in a group for sure. And then they can purpose them by, it would be natural for them to purpose them by those two different usages separately.
Thank you.
You're right. If you had just had one and you can't sort it by, maybe you have one object store and two feeds off of it. A lot of the products do that. Then once again, they wouldn't get confused as long as they only ever uploaded, you know, Chocolatey to their Chocolatey feed and NuGet to their NuGet feed. Cool. Just as a side note too, I've been building training and products for the Windows IT admin space, and then I participate a lot in the open source packaging still. I do the PowerShell package. I actually did the Linux installer for PowerShell Core that runs off of the PowerShell repo. So if I try to be aware of and sense where the Windows packaging community is, where the Windows DevOps community is for automation and CI/CD and deployment automation. And then I'm aware of most of the parts of Linux. I'm growing in my dependency manager stuff. So like Maven, NPM, these aren't things I've dived into. I do apt-get, I do Yum. So I'm still growing on that side. But if you guys have questions too about, hey, you want to get a view on what Windows folks who are doing DevOps or traditional IT might think or want, you know, give me a shout. Obviously, you have to validate that with customers, but I try to sense it and be aware of it, just so you know.
Awesome. Well, if no one else has any questions, yeah, just thanks again for volunteering to do this and get this together. This was really awesome. I'm sure we'll be chatting and have some more questions for you as we move along, but we really appreciate it.
No problem. My pleasure.
All right, we'll stop the recording.